Hello, human geographers. We are here for the final lecture of Chapter 3, that is migration. We're also here for the final lecture of Unit number 2, all of population and migration together. We are going to be finishing up tonight when we talk about refugees. So here we go. First slide tonight is just about some of the definitions, and this is of vital importance. These three different definitions we absolutely, without a doubt, have to be able to differentiate between. So make sure that you really underline the key parts of these definitions so that we can understand this. Refugees, people who are forced to migrate from their home country and cannot return due to a well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or political opinion. Notice here that these people are forced to migrate. This is a forced migration. And when you look at all the different reasons why they might be persecuted, race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, political opinion, as far as push and pull factors, pushing them away, these are all basically cultural factors. None of these are economic in nature. None of these are environmental in nature. Though it could be noted that people might be considered, or the term refugee might be used, especially in the media, which, sometimes the media doesn't get it right, but might be used for people who are forced to migrate as a result of a natural disaster. So you might hear refugees of Hurricane Katrina or something like that. But that's not the usual case. So to be very clear, the vast majority of refugees are going to be pushed out, forced out, because of cultural factors, and it's the well-founded fear of persecution. It might not necessarily be that they are directly persecuted yet, but that fear of being persecuted, or fear of their life, fear for safety, something like that. Asylum seekers are someone who has migrated to another country in the hope of being recognized as a refugee. So you'll notice there the emphasis is already there, hope of being recognized. And essentially what asylum is protection from the government. So they are seeking the protection of the government of another country. So the big difference between refugees and asylum seekers is that a refugee has been granted asylum. They have been granted that protection. Whereas an asylum seeker is seeking that protection. And so when they get that protection, then they're classified as a refugee. So it's important to differentiate between that. And it's interesting to note that 2013, which is the last year that I found fairly consistent numbers for, the United States had 84,343 asylum claims, which was the largest recipient of claims in the world, and that was true of the United States for the 8th year in a row. We've had the largest asylum claims for 8 years leading up to 2013. And so we're going to talk about that because that's a fairly significant year here in just a couple minutes. Finally, an internally displaced person, that is an IDP. Internally displaced person, as the name kind of suggests, they are internally displaced. They're displaced within their country. Here's the definition. Someone who has been forced to migrate for similar political reasons as a refugee, but has not migrated across an international border. So all three of these very, very similar. Really, refugees and internally displaced persons are the same. The difference is, did they cross an international border? Refugees did, internally displaced persons did not. And then asylum seekers did cross an international border, but haven't yet been granted that protection, that asylum, by a foreign government. They might be, but haven't yet been. As far as numbers, the United Nations reports 45.2 million refugees worldwide, but to be clear, that actually includes internally displaced persons as well. And so this is once again where some of these numbers and some of these statistics can be kind of confusing depending on who is reporting them. And that's when we have to be critical thinkers. We have to go, well, wait a minute. You said 45.2 million. Is that refugees? Is that refugees and asylum seekers? Is that refugees, asylum seekers, IDPs? What do you mean by that? And so we don't want to just take a piece of information and say, okay, that's what it is. We want to think critically about it and say, okay, how did you get to this number? Can I see the evidence behind this? And that's why those numbers can vary quite a bit. In this case, that number does include internally displaced persons, and that's important to understand. So as you can see down there below, there's two different types that are classified under the United Nations number. International refugees, which are going to be those individuals who do cross an international border, and intranational. And you'll remember from a previous lecture that we said intra means within. And so this is going to be people who have abandoned their homes, but not their homelands. And how do we classify that? What do we call those people who have abandoned their homes, but not their homeland? They haven't left the country. We call those IDPs. All right, so let's take a look at this. This is, and the next few slides all come from the UNHCR, which is again that United Nations High Commission or High Commissioner on Refugees. So these are some of these statements just to give us some context about global refugees and refugee numbers so we have some context. Every time you blink, a person is forced to flee. Last year, 7.6 million people fled their homes to escape armed conflict. So it's important to ask the question, to be critical thinkers. You say, fled their homes. Does that mean refugees? Does that mean asylum seekers? Does that mean IDPs? They don't address it here, but I'm willing to bet that what they're talking about here are all three combined. Just people forced to flee, which includes all refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs. But they don't overtly say that, so we have to be kind of questioning of that, which means 20,765 every day, 14 every minute, 1 every 4 seconds. That's once every time you blink, just to give you some context. Again, there's that 45.2 million number that we mentioned earlier. Now we see it broken down. It's 15.4 million refugees, another about 1 million people who are seeking asylum, and then almost 30 million are internally displaced, which means that the vast majority, 2/3 of this number, are people who don't even flee their country but leave their home. And again, how much attention is being brought to that? How much attention do we see focused on people who are forced to leave but don't actually leave the country? And so that's something that we have to keep in the back of our minds. As much attention is placed on people who are forced to leave their country, because again, now we're seeing other countries impacted because they're moving into other countries. There's a significantly larger number who don't leave the country but are forced to leave their home for all the same reasons. And is that any less significant? So we know that the Syrian refugee crisis is huge, but here's some context. In 2012, 1.1 million people worldwide became refugees. And again, the question is for UNHCR, are they specifically saying refugees, or do we mean refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs? This one's a little less clear. So that would be a question that I would have. And in 2013, 1.1 million people, during a span of 6 months, became refugees in Syria. So one country, in half the time, 6 months, less than a year, same amount of people from one conflict. That's huge. Now, UNHCR also talks about where a lot of these people are going. And so in this particular graphic, they talk about 81% of the world's refugees are hosted by less developed countries, LDCs, led by Pakistan, Iran, and Kenya. And so more importantly than that, I want you to identify, at least for those 3 countries that are specifically listed, are we talking about semi-periphery or periphery? We know they're LDCs, but are they semi-periphery or periphery? Because that's important, because we know that they're less developed, meaning that the lower level of development, which means they might have fewer resources to help provide for all of these people. And it's even more the case if it's a periphery country. And so that's something that is important to note, that the vast majority of people who are forced to migrate are migrating to countries that are, one, nearby, that's an element of distance decay, but also countries that tend to be less developed. And then we got some information about refugees later on. So 526,000 refugees were able to go home, but ongoing conflicts kept millions in exile. That process of going home is a vocabulary term that we call repatriation. We'll talk about that later this lecture. And then we have 88,600 refugees restarted their lives in a new country, an 11% increase from 2011. That's called resettlement. Also something that we'll discuss later this lecture. So make sure that you know that those last two bullet points there deal with repatriation and resettlement respectively. So a couple maps now to talk about. First one, let's ask questions. What type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we analyzing this? And that scale question can be kind of tricky because you'll see like the yellow outline, which is to show significant conflicts or significant events that are creating refugees, kind of supersedes national boundaries, but the political divisions that we see are national boundaries. So that's important to understand. So this says 4.3 million people were newly displaced, and this is as of 2011. And of that 4.3 million, 3.5 million were internally displaced, meaning 800,000 were refugees or seeking asylum, crossing an international boundary. But 3.5 million were internally displaced. And one of the biggest drivers of internally displaced persons is Colombia. And you can see that there. Colombia has had a conflict raging for decades now that continues on and is creating a lot of internally displaced persons that maybe doesn't get a lot of media attention, again, because so many of those people that are being displaced within Colombia. And this image reinforces that. So this highlights some different countries that have been major drivers of internally displaced persons, in this case in 2010. Colombia, we mentioned, there's a link there to a video dealing with the conflict that is taking place there. Sudan, it's important to note that this is prior to the breakup of Sudan. And the 4.9 million people that were internally displaced, that doesn't include refugees, this is just IDPs. 4.9 million people internally displaced within Sudan. A lot of that is people being driven to the south due to the conflict, due to the violence that was happening in Sudan, still is happening with Sudan and South Sudan. But this is prior to the breakup of Sudan, and you'll notice on the map that Sudan is all one country, which it no longer is. It is broken up into Sudan and South Sudan, again, a product of a decades-long civil war. So, in addition to that, how do we identify refugees? And there's a few different ways. The UN definition is very, very similar to our definition of refugee, and that is a person who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political group. And so that's the UN definition, very, very similar to our definition of what a refugee is. But in addition to that, there's generally some characteristics that we may look for, that we may see with a lot of refugees. For example, many refugees move with only what they can carry. And so you can see that in the image below, people just carrying packs, carrying whatever they can. And that's an especially difficult decision because a lot of times people are going to carry with them what they need to survive. But then as a result, they're leaving behind family heirlooms, they're leaving behind things that are of personal importance, but maybe wouldn't necessarily help them to survive. And so that's remarkably sad, excluding the fact that a lot of the times these conflicts create death and violence and things like that is obviously more traumatizing. A lot of times these journeys begin on foot, bicycle, wagon, boat. You're not going to see a lot of people traveling by airplanes and things like that. Though there was a news story last couple of years that talked about in Syria, there was a young man who was attending college. And in Syria, they have compulsory military service, meaning that you have to serve in the military if you are a young man. But they will postpone that military service if you are attending college. And so this young man was attending college, got his degree, and the day that he graduated college, his parents put him on a plane and flew him off to Europe to try and avoid him having to serve in the Syrian military, and obviously because of the Syrian civil war, potentially could die as a result. Now that's one specific example that's counter to this, but the vast majority of people aren't going to have the means in order to do this. And so they're going to get out in any way that they can, and a lot of times that's with whatever they have at hand. And a lot of times we'll lack official documents that people typically need in order to move internationally. So passports, visas, those types of things are absent. They won't have them. So this is a graph looking at U.S. refugee numbers, not so much necessary for now because the numbers are a little out of date, but a little bit of practice with just basic geography skills. Like what I'd like you to do is identify the regions that each of these places are coming from, or where each of these countries are. And in the case of Burma, is there an alternative name that we should be familiar with as well? So Burma, the largest driver of U.S. refugee numbers, at least in the recent past. This does not really account for the Syrian refugee crisis, which obviously is going to influence refugee numbers into the United States as well. Bhutan, Iraq, Somalia, Cuba, Eritrea, Iran, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and then all other countries, including unknown countries. So we can see some of those numbers, and it's very significant. And in fact, later in this lecture, we'll talk about President Obama had pledged to bring in 10,000 Syrian refugees. So where would that kind of fall on this? And obviously that's a very controversial decision. Some people feel very strongly that we shouldn't bring in any. Some people feel very strongly that we should bring in more. Very controversial issue, but where would that fall on this? And does that perhaps surprise you with what maybe the kind of thoughts that you had in your head about refugee numbers and things like that? In addition, let's take a look at some examples. These are always good in the event of an FRQ to be able to draw from real-world examples to provide as evidence when you're talking about this. So one example that we have up there obviously is Syria, the Syrian refugee crisis, and there's a couple articles there, a video and one's an article saying that Syrian refugee numbers have now surpassed 4 million. That's a little old, and so let me update those numbers for you. Syrian refugee numbers are now 4.8 million in just the surrounding countries, especially in Jordan and Turkey. Another 1 million who are seeking asylum in Europe, and then 6.6 million who are internally displaced, which means that the numbers are really more like between 12 and 13 million people who have been displaced in Syria. In addition to that, a couple other examples, historical as well as contemporary examples. Civil wars in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Angola, Sudan, all serve as examples where huge refugee numbers were generated as a result. The ethnic war between the Hutu and Tutsi groups in Rwanda. Now these are ethnic groups, and really ethnic war probably could more accurately be described as genocide, as we will discuss in our ethnic unit when we talk about this, because this is something that still has impacts to this day, especially in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Burundi, neighboring countries where it has spilled over into. Ongoing conflict and disputes between Israelis and Palestinians in Afghanistan. And remember earlier that Pakistan and Iran, two of the largest countries with the largest refugee hosts, part of this is due to the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan. People have fled, and different people for different reasons. Some people have fled due to how cruel the Taliban rule has been. Others fled during the Soviet invasion of the late 1970s into the 80s. Others have fled because of the U.S. involvement during the 2000s. And so is it any surprise then that Pakistan and Iran have some of the largest refugee numbers of any country on earth? And then finally, the boat people who fled, and boat people is a term that was created for these huge numbers of people who fled Vietnam following or during and after the Vietnam War. After the communists took over in Vietnam, these boat people piled onto ships that were not high quality ships, that were not intended for deep seas, in an attempt to try and escape the communist rule there. And thousands of people died trying to escape. These boats were not intended for deep waters. And we could use a very similar example to this here in just a moment. And that is with the Rohingya people. The Rohingyas in Myanmar are a group of ethnic minority Muslims in a predominantly Buddhist country who have been persecuted against. And so these ethnic minority Muslims are trying to flee Myanmar, which also goes by Burma. The U.S. government recognizes it as Burma, but many other countries from around the world will recognize it as Myanmar. And the Rohingya are attempting to flee Myanmar in very much the same way as many of the boat people were attempting to flee Vietnam. So a contemporary example of people who are still fleeing because they are an ethnic minority, because they are a religious minority, and being persecuted against. Once again, another example that comes from a different region of the world, this case Europe. The collapse of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, 1 million people were displaced. And I'd like to ask, first off, let's take a look at the map. What type of map are we looking at there? And this is showing refugees and displaced people from the former Yugoslavia. And that's a graduated symbol map. And over 1 million people were displaced, and Yugoslavia collapsed. And we'll examine this more during our political and ethnicity units. And 5 independent countries were created after the collapse of Yugoslavia. But in addition to that, another country was created later when Serbia and Montenegro split. But we have Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's one country together. That's the official title of the country. Croatia, Macedonia, which also goes by the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Serbia and Montenegro, which again later split. Now it is Serbia as one country and Montenegro as another. And in fact, Serbia has, as part of its official UN-recognized territory, an area of Kosovo, which the U.S. recognizes as separate and sovereign, but the UN does not. And there's been ethnic fighting going on. There's been refugees that have been generated as a result of conflict there. So another example that we could use as well. And then finally, Slovenia. And taking a look at this image, and again, I'll ask the question, what type of map is this? We see a few different map types. Last slide was a graduated symbol map. This time, we see a cartogram. This distorts the size of the countries relative to the amount of data. Now, the top map is looking at country of origin. So these are where most of the refugees are coming from. And so we can notice that there's not a lot in the Americas, though Colombia is noticeably larger, and that a lot of the refugees are being generated in areas like Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, those types of areas. And the bottom map is looking at countries of destination. Where are most of the people going? And so we can see the U.S. is significantly larger than it was as far as a country of origin, because we are bringing in a lot of refugees. But again, Europe is very big, but most of the refugees end up in less developed countries, periphery and semi-periphery countries. Finally, a couple of different things, a couple different definitions that we have to mention. So when refugees go to another place, those destinations, there's a couple different questions about what's going to happen to them in the future. So the question is repatriation or resettlement. Repatriation is one of our vocabulary terms, so let's underline. A refugee or group of refugees returning to their home country, usually with the assistance of a government or, and this is going to be an important acronym to know, non-governmental organization, NGO. And so repatriation means the returning to the country of origin, so people going back home. And we saw earlier that, 526,000, over 500,000 people repatriated, went back home. But that millions more are still internally or internationally displaced, 45 million according to the UN. But repatriation is people being able to go back to their homes. Resettlement is people being resettled within another country. So we actually see governments taking people in and finding a place for them, finding a new home for them within a country. And this is the question about, where are people going to end up? And so that's what we mean by that. And the UN said that about 88,000 people had been resettled. And that's, an important process in the whole recognition of refugees and things like that is, where is going to be their new home? That's a big question for someone who is a refugee. Where are they going to go? Where's that new home going to be? And so resettlement is the more official process of identifying a new home for them. And so again, an additional piece of information, if you are so inclined to look into this, Wyoming is the one and only state in the United States that does not have a resettlement program to screen or sponsor refugees. It's the only state. It's also important to note that it is our smallest state. So is that something that could influence the decision to not have a resettlement program? And they're debating whether or not, and so this article looks at the fact that Wyoming doesn't have a resettlement program. They don't have it. And, will they have it? Won't they have it? It's a very controversial opinion on both sides. And so that's something that individual people are going to voice their opinions on. And it's important to formulate your opinions based on some of the information that is out there. So that's what this lecture was about, preparing us to have that discussion in class, and I'll see you there. Have a good night, everybody.